Jalanguru Manangaru, Balangaru. Good morning, everyone. I would like to acknowledge all the traditional owners upon whose lands we meet today. I myself am speaking from the lands of my Bunuba people here in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. I pay my respects to all our elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge Governor Philip Lowe, Deputy Governor Guy Debelle, and central bank representatives from Australia, Canada, the United States, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Professor Dennis Foley, who will speak following my address, and all the other people who are participating in this event. My name is June Oscar. I am a Bunuba woman from the remote town of Fitzroy Crossing in Western Australia's Kimberley region. I am Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. Before I came into this role in 2017, I held a number of leadership positions in my community here in the Kimberley. As an advocate for Indigenous Australian languages, social justice, women's issues, and measures to reduce fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. I'm very pleased to be speaking today at this inaugural symposium of the Central Bank Network for Indigenous Inclusion. I commend the Reserve Bank of Australia, Te Pūtea Matua, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and the Bank of Canada on formalising this network to raise awareness of Indigenous economic and financial issues. This work builds upon the legacy of the bank's first governor, Dr. H.C. Nugget Coombs, who I had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with on several occasions. Nugget was a great ally of our peoples, and I would like to acknowledge his granddaughter, Susan Moylan Coombs, an impressive First Nations leader in her own right, who is here with us today. So hello, Susan. I would also like to acknowledge that this is the beginning of a new and important connection between two very important and significant national organisations, the RBA and my own organisation, the Australian Human Rights Commission. My role this morning is to set the theme, to describe the experiences of First Nations Australians over the past 233 years of colonisation, to explain the present and outline the challenges we face as a result of this legacy, and to present my views on what must be done for us to move forward. Australian First Nations peoples, cultures are amongst the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. For millennia, we have existed as the human element of the lands and waters that defined our country. Singing, dancing, fishing, gathering, burning, planting, building, harvesting, and coming together with neighbours to interact socially and economically, and to take part in shared ceremonies. 1788 marked the beginning of the British not just transporting human cargo, but transplanting its entire economic, governmental, and judicial system onto our lands, which has threatened to eradicate the structures, values, and knowledge base of our First Nations civilization. From my Bunaba Nation's historical experience, I have traced the frontier period of violence and beyond with ongoing discriminatory policies, a history characterized by heroic resistance, mass killings of men, women, and children, extensive transportation, imprisonment, and servitude, disease, church mission impacts, interaction with the authoritarian colonial state, sexual abuse of women within a patriarchal frontier society, and the impact of alcohol and the congested living in the post-colonial era. All First Nations, all our lives, have been subject to this history within the totality of building the modern Australian nation state. Historical injustices experienced by First Nations peoples continue to have profound consequences for wealth creation for our families and communities today, with their parents and grandparents stripped of the means to live and care for their families by traditional means. It is within the living memory of many of our elders that our peoples faced formal restrictions on their ability to accumulate wealth, own a home or business, or participate equally in economic opportunities. While our labour played a pivotal role in many industries, such as cattle farming, railroad construction, sugarcane growing, and pearl diving, this was largely to the benefit of non-Indigenous peoples and business owners and workers. There is a clear link between this history and the contemporary gaps between First Nations peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in terms of wealth, income, employment, educational attainment, and well-being. Exclusion, dispossession, dislocation, injustice, and discrimination have driven a cumulative pattern of inherited poverty and trauma across generations. I myself was born in a time when our people did not yet have citizenship rights. As a child, I lived through the era when laws precluding our equal participation in Australia's political, social, and economic institutions were abolished. Such milestones were momentous. To have the Australian population rally around us provided hope for what the future might look like. In some ways, that future has come to pass. It is within my lifetime that we have seen the first of our mob graduate with a university degree, sit in the Parliament of Australia, become head of a government department, and to be appointed to the Federal Court. While we have every reason to celebrate these individual achievements, we cannot, however, forget that the reality in which we live is still that of many distinct and complex cultures that have no choice but to live within the context of a dominant colonial society. Where Australian governments have sought to progress equality, they have done so overwhelmingly through assimilating First Nations people into Western structures, which are blind to our inherent cultural difference and the deprivation we have suffered over the past 232 years. The truth is that over the last 3 decades, following the Mabo decision, which overthrew the lie of terra nullius and acknowledged the truth that we have occupied these lands and waters since a time immemorial, even in those moments when we do reclaim our rights to land, language, and culture, we are constantly having to negotiate within the conditions and expectations of Western society. To this day, our worldviews have never been taken into consideration in a way that might require any real compromise by Australian governments. Real self-determination has never been tried, and this sits at the very heart of why attempts by governments to address our disadvantage over the past several decades have continued to fail. Had the seeds planted by Nugget Coombs and others between 1975 and 1996 been given sufficient time to grow, we might be in quite a different situation today. Regrettably, they were trampled under the boot of a so-called practical agenda, which, underpinned by an ideological shift towards individualism and neoliberal economic models, flipped the onus of responsibility back on First Nations peoples. We were expected to find a way to fit, without protest, into current structures, as if our grievances were holding back progression. This retrograde step has had a profound effect. It has allowed that even up until the present, racist, paternalistic, and assimilationist ideas hold a significant influence. That these ideas are still part of our political discourse is unsurprising, given the underlying racism pervading our society. It is racism that sits behind assertions that our ongoing connection to country is nothing but a lifestyle choice, that we are lazy, simple-minded, given to substance abuse, inherently violent, that we feel entitled to a free ride, and that our continuing disadvantage stems from our struggle to adapt to a more sophisticated culture. Such messages create unsafe spaces in the world around and can all too easily infect our inner spaces too. I have heard young and older people alike question their identity and the identity of others, and whether being Indigenous is causing the issues they face. The notion that we and our culture are to blame for the issues we face, or that because of the colour of our skin, we are not Indigenous enough, has no basis in truth. Yet, without truth-telling about how structural forces laid down at colonization continue to undermine them. The causes of the problems First Nations peoples experience are obscured and are at risk of being seen as their fault alone, isolated in the present. As First Nations peoples, we must live in the knowledge that our peoples governed themselves over tens of thousands of years and stand united in the conviction that colonization has not broken us. It is the system that is broken. There is no doubt we have a remarkable capacity to survive, but we want more than survival. We want to heal beyond trauma and restore family and community bonds and societal-wide health and well-being. We had enough of being ignored and of taking part in processes that are limited to tweaking fundamentally flawed systems that have failed to alleviate the disadvantage we experience. Indeed, despite Australia having had over 2 decades of economic growth, for at least a third of our people, a life above the poverty line is out of reach. Whatever our income as First Nations people, we all observe cultural and moral obligations to share our limited resources to meet the immediate basic needs of our wider families and communities. This means that for many of us, there is very little, if any, surplus income to invest. As such, the provision of economic security for our families and communities into the future is very limited and often non-existent. Not only are we undermined by our lower incomes, we also lack financial assets. For many native title holders, there is an expectation that a successful native title determination will be the foundation for sustainable economic development. The reality is that non-exclusive native title rights do not allow traditional owners to control access to or use of land and waters over which they have native title rights. This restricts economic development projects that do not require freehold title, exclusive use of land, or in any way restrict the rights of other stakeholders with an interest in the determination area. Despite having grown exponentially over recent years, largely due to the Australian government's introduction of the Indigenous procurement policy, our stake in the economy in terms of dollars is still also disproportionately low. First Nations businesses currently earn more than $1 billion per year. While this number may seem quite large in comparison to the revenue generated by the top 1,000 companies in Australia, which totaled $1.94 trillion in 2017. It is a drop in the ocean. Ultimately, our economic empowerment cannot be just about fitting into the mainstream. It must be about designing our own economic base that can bring about the social, cultural, political future we all want. We know that when recognized and supported by the structures and the world around us, the strengths of people and communities can be harnessed to create positive change. And we are asking for nothing less than a fundamental change in the way government does business with First Nations peoples. Our aspirations are backed by international law, under which First Nations peoples have the right to self-determination, to social and cultural development, and to our own institutions, and to freedom from assimilation, discrimination, and the destruction of our culture. We have the right to own, use, and develop our country, and to be compensated for deprivation of our means of subsistence and development. And we have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining economic and social programs affecting us, and as far as possible, to administer such programs through our own institutions. Giving effect to these rights will require breaking new ground, experimentation, and learning on the go. If we can agree that continuing to count failure while doing nothing substantially different is unacceptable, then we can agree that the risk inherent in this approach is entirely necessary. It is only through a fundamental shift in the way First Nations people are represented, respected, and empowered in this country that we will see the long-term systemic change that is needed to close the gap in outcomes for our people. But this is not only the only gap we must close. Those First Nations people at the intersection of identity markers, such as our women and girls, face additional discrimination and disadvantage. In December last year, I launched my We Yaniyu Dangani, Women's Voices, Securing Our Rights, Securing Our Future report 2020. The first of its kind in Australia in 34 years, to represent the voices of First Nations women and girls as a collective. The report, which sets out a high-level plan for structural change in response to First Nations women and girls' concerns, aspirations, and solutions, provides a much-needed First Nations gender lens to a broad range of issues and policy areas. A key finding of We Yaniyu Dangani was that in the absence of a coherent, consistent, and intersectional approach to responding to First Nations women and girls across Australian policy-making processes, the experiences, their needs and aspirations are obscured, undermining their agency over matters that affect their lives, and, as a result, the efficacy of policies meant to support them. With respect to the economy, We Yaniyu Dangani found that it is our women who do the lion's share of unpaid and underpaid work, and we do it all with care, compassion, and determination. Our women are holding up our families and communities. We keep communities functioning. We take our kids and elders out onto country and keep businesses and offices ticking over. We look after our families when they are struggling, care for our own children and many, many others. This makes it harder for our women to get established in the workforce or gain opportunities for higher paid jobs. It also makes it more difficult for women to recover from financial woes triggered by illness, separation, or domestic violence. And taken together, this also means that many have less superannuation at retirement. Our women and girls are calling for change, that we must invest far more into our women and girls shouldn't be controversial. The OECD and many UN forums recognize gender equality as one of the single greatest goals to improve social and economic outcomes. Investment into growth sectors that our women are employed in, such as care work for children, those with disability, and the elderly, is likely to drive significant economic growth. Recent analysis by Sydney University's draws on research showing that 1% investment of GDP into care industries across 7 OECD countries generates more employment than investment into construction. If applied to Australian markets, it is estimated the employment ratio would be 5:1. The evidence also tells us that our women's control over income and financial resources and engagement in meaningful work is correlated with improved health and educational outcomes for children, as well as reduction in gender-based violence. Investing in the potential of our women has many beneficial flow-on effects that simultaneously boost the economy and reduces costs related to a multitude of social harms, including incarceration and the removal and detention of children. Since the launch of Wiyaniudangani, I have seen firsthand First Nations women from around the country use the report to take important steps towards their self-determination. Momentum is building and a lot of excitement about the commencement of a third phase of the project where women can participate in a countrywide process where they, governments, and other key stakeholders can come together to put in place a holistic framework to progress First Nations gender equality and a fairer and more prosperous future for us all. The implementation of this framework will require the collective power that can only be harnessed through partnerships between private, public, and community organisations. And I look forward to further discussions about how we can work together to achieve shared goals. Yaninja, and thank you.